No, hello. It's my pleasure to be here, and thank you for being here too. My name's Andy Dyer, and I'm at the University of South Carolina, Aiken, which is a little town near Augusta. And I want to talk about food and and health in a slightly different way today than I think that we've been hearing about, although some of the speakers earlier certainly touched on many of the things that are near and dear to my heart. I also want to thank Stephen for inviting me, and also that basically introduction that he did before the introduction, which is about all these different food products and resources that you have that make it just clearer and clearer to me that the one thing we're worried about more than anything else is the quality of our food and not just the quantity. And so that's going to be the focus of my talk today. There was an epidemic in the United States beginning in 1902, and that affected some 3 million people and killed over 100,000. The disease was pellagra. There we go. That's, by the way, my personal favorite epidemic. If you don't have a favorite epidemic, I highly recommend pellagra. It's a good choice. Some people would say bubonic plague, and some would say the Spanish flu are excellent epidemics, but there's a good reason for us to focus on this one. This was a disease of nutrition. This was a disease of poor food quality. It was discovered later that pellagra results from a diet deficient in vitamin B3, or niacin. The poorest people in the southern states often subsisted on what was called the 3M diet. It was meat, molasses, and meal, which is actually dried meat and molasses and cornmeal or grits. And after 1901, cornmeal was processed using the degermination process, where the germ was removed from the corn, and in so doing, the vitamins and the oils were also removed from the corn. The reason for that was because cornmeal didn't spoil as quickly. It could stay on the shelf. And that's why it was removed. But it was the very poor people that were affected. They began showing signs of pellagra within a year or two. And it had only been seen previous to that in Spain, Italy, poor populations in those places, and a few other places. Of course, because it had only been seen in those places, immigrants to the United States were blamed for the new disease, which was spreading rapidly and was obviously contagious. The victims developed rough, scaly, red skin, and eventually, as it progressed, became delirious, and then were confined to mental hospitals where they often were continued to be under malnutrition, they were undernourished, and eventually they died by the thousands. I'm in South Carolina. South Carolina was particularly hit hard by this disease. The governments argued that it couldn't be a food quality problem because, for one, this is America, and in America people don't starve to death. But two, people confined to hospitals were fed plenty of food and they died anyway. So clearly it wasn't food. The real issue was that we knew very little about the quality of the food calories they were getting, and we focused on the quantity of those calories. This should sound familiar to us today. The degermination of the corn removed the oils and prevented spoilage. We do the same thing with wheat. We remove all the vitamins and minerals, and then we add them back in. Enriched wheat. Doesn't that sound better than whole grain wheat? Enriched. I think everyone will agree that the quality of the food we eat is diminishing. The diversity of choices of food is diminishing. Our understanding of how to practice healthy diets, healthy food habits, is a problem. And the increasing number of health issues we're seeing is related in some way to the foods that we're consuming as a culture. I believe that in some ways we're reliving the pellagra epidemic of the early 1900s. Let me start off by saying that food is a biological problem, or at least it used to be. In the past, food production was more of a slow dance with nature. It was this close relationship between farmers and the land, and the product of that interaction between the two was food. Maintaining soil quality was a great concern to farmers because long-term soil fertility was the foundation of food production and the foundation of their livelihood. Farmers had a very close relationship with soil, but that changed dramatically after World War II with the development of artificial fertilizers and synthetic pesticides. Farmers didn't really have to tend the soil so much because they could add fertility and they could they could deal with the problems they faced. And the problem was that both of these technologies, pesticides and fertilizers, were very hostile to soil. And of course, this was then followed by changes in the scale of agriculture. And we've heard about monocultures in earlier talks, in commercial economics, and we've been hearing quite a bit of that last night and today. And then after that, the genetic manipulation of the crops themselves. So today, farming and food production is basically a recipe. We take seeds, add dirt, water, fertilizer, pesticides, sunlight, and then harvest and repeat. The soil is a substance that holds the plants in place, and it allows for the delivery of water and artificial nutrients. In fact, increasingly, the soil is seen as unnecessary and inefficient. Food can be grown merely by providing nutrients to the plants. The environment is essentially sterile, and mass production is factory style. Now, of course, we heard earlier that meat production has followed a very similar path. I want to focus on plants in this talk. Today, agriculture is no longer a biological problem, but more specifically, it is a biological problem that's being addressed with technological solutions. What I'd like to talk about is this fundamental disconnect that such an arrangement creates between the food we're eating and nature, which is the context in which that food is made. For the past 70 years or so, since the end of World War II, agriculture has focused more and more on quantity and with less and less regard for quality. In fact, we've redefined quality to mean appearance and quantity. That's what quality now means. In fact, in the 1970s, having a soda when I was a kid meant occasionally having one of these. Today, it means the daily consumption of very large drinks, often with unlimited access, which is astonishing. We couldn't have believed that when we were children. To accomplish this, the fundamentals of soft drinks had to change. The ingredients of soda are largely artificial, and they can be produced cheaply and in enormous quantities. To accomplish this, we've attempted to take complex biological systems and make them simplistic technological processes. Food production can be mechanized, and that means fewer steps and less time. We don't allow nature to make food for us. We've taken over the process, and in a very impatient way. People don't realize the lengths to which we've already gone to produce the vast quantities of food that we are now marketing. I don't know if you've ever seen, this is a peninsula with El Ejido, Spain, the town, somewhere in the middle there, in the Alboran Sea, which is in the Straits of Gibraltar. That used to be farming, entirely farming country. It still is farming country, but here's the difference. That's what it looks like today. From space, you can see those greenhouses. They take up the entire peninsula. Some 40% of the fresh produce eaten in Europe comes from this peninsula, year-round, because it's got a great environment. In these worlds, nature has been replaced by technology. The food production recipe reigns supreme. To feed the US and the world, we've devised ways to produce enormous quantities of calories, but fewer and fewer calories of quality. And I'm going to claim that the speed at which we produce food in great quantity creates a trade-off that limits the quality of that food. So by a trade-off, I mean giving up something to get something else, right? If I have $100 and I need to buy shirts, I can buy a couple of high-quality shirts, or I can buy a large number of low-quality shirts. It's trade-off in quality. If a fruit tree has enough energy to make 100 fruits, but I force that tree to make 200 fruits, I'm either going to have much smaller fruits or I'm going to have much lower quality fruits. If an acre of land can produce 50 bushels of corn, but I can find a way to get 300 bushels of corn out of that acre, something has to give. And we understand that. That's not news. We understand that. And so we focus on the growth process. And we've simplified that food production process to the fewest number of steps and then attempted to maximize the flow of resources to maximize the yield. Because this is now a technological process, we believe that the rate of production should equal the rate of resource supply. That makes perfect sense. And then there should be no effect whatsoever on quality. Not only is this not true in technological systems, like automobile production, where high rates of production result in high rates of mistakes, it's never true in biological systems. To force high productivity, we have to give up high quality because biological systems have an important element that's being ignored, and that element is time. That is, the quality is a function of time. There's a process of specialization, of differentiation, of maturation, importantly of maturation. There's a sequence of events that have to take place, and each of those requires time. When we hurry food production, we can produce something that has the appearance of food, but it lacks the maturity and the complexity of the food. This is the essence of craftsmanship. The making of a Stradivarius violin, or of a Michelangelo sculpture, a Leonardo da Vinci painting. Those were labors of love, of painstaking attention to detail, of time spent considering and reconsidering. The growing of food with quality is allowing the plant time to adjust and respond and defend and mature, and without that, quality is reduced, maybe even eliminated. Additionally, to maintain artificially low food prices, we force the producers of food to come up with easy-to-produce products that are also, of necessity, lower quality. That's the impetus that drives competition in the marketplace. In today's world, higher productivity with lower cost means mechanization. And that means technological solutions, and in this case, to a very biological problem. So, how did we get here? You saw this picture a little earlier, I think. 70 years ago, World War II had just ended and two revolutions occurred in farming, and by the way, to the delight of farmers everywhere. First, artificial fertilizer was introduced as a result of the nitrogen compounds that were left over from the production of munitions during the war. Food production was greatly increased as a result of fertilizers. Second, synthetic pesticides were introduced, specifically DDT and DDE. DDT was widely used for terrestrial applications. DDE was used for aquatic applications. And that was to confront the growing problem with agricultural pests. Pesticides and fertilizers had immediate effects on farms. Sometimes within a single year, the effects of pesticide overuse could be seen. The first year, a pound of DDT might completely wipe out a target pest, but by the second year, maybe 2 pounds were necessary. Within 5 years, 10 pounds might be necessary, but only half of the insects were dying. The biological reason was clear. Insects were adapting to the toxins. That wasn't, by the way, a mystery to anybody. All scientists, ecologists, and evolutionary biologists knew that. Mutations for resistance to the toxins were being favored. The survivors were producing offspring that were also resistant, and insect populations were shifting rapidly and were much less susceptible. In agriculture, the underlying reason for this increased amount of pesticides that was needed to kill each succeeding generation of the crop pests, this was very clear by the 1950s. DDT had lost its effectiveness by 1955 in many agricultural applications, particularly cotton. We understood how natural selection worked, but the response by humans to that understanding was somewhat less logical. The effectiveness of the toxins was decreasing because resistance in the insects was increasing, but the so-called solution was to make better and more powerful pesticides. The illogical part, of course, was the implication that this resistance was either not going to happen a second time or a third time or a thousandth time, or the assumption was that creating new toxins could just be repeated indefinitely. Neither of those were true, and we should have known it. With an accurate understanding of evolutionary biology, the most important lesson was this: chemicals select for their own obsolescence. Each and every toxin will locate every mutation for resistance, and it will offer that mutation unlimited success. This is very much like reading the children's books, Where's Waldo? Every large population of insects, or any pest, has a Waldo mutation. And the chemical can find that mutation immediately. The stronger the chemical, the faster it will find it. A pesticide kills all of the insects that are susceptible, and the only ones still living are in some way resistant or tolerant of the pesticide. This finding of the mutation is no more difficult than just finding the living insects. There it is. An important corollary is this: the harder we hit the pests, the faster we'll find that mutation for resistance. The more we kill, the more we encourage resistance to emerge. Now, there's a definite aspect of irony to this. If a toxin kills only 50% of the pests, we can't always be sure why 50% of them lived. There could be a lot of different reasons when half of them survive. Their offspring may or may not be resistant to the herbicide or pesticide or insecticide. But if 99.999% of them die, the survivors are alive for only one reason. They are resistant, and the offspring of those will also be resistant. In a population of 1 billion insects, 99.999% dead still leaves 10,000 alive. And those 10,000 will take over, and they'll take over very quickly. In other words, the technological solution of making better and more powerful pesticides to kill more completely helps us arrive at this conclusion: the harder we hit them, the faster we're going to lose the fight. No living insect has ever failed at this game. All insects are faced with chemical challenges because the majority of insects eat plants, and all plants defend themselves from insects with chemicals. All plants produce toxins to fend off would-be herbivores. All would-be herbivores have adapted to these toxins, or they wouldn't be here today. When we apply chemicals to crops in the hopes of killing our pests, we're challenging them to do the one thing that they do better than anything else, and that is cope with chemical stress. As biological entities, they are capable of adapting to the chemical stresses in their environment and in a short amount of time. And the more powerful the chemical, the shorter the amount of time that's needed to adapt. These are the rules of evolutionary biology. They've been spelled out for decades. We've known this since well before we started applying artificial pesticides to our crops. Here's the bottom line, though. Biological systems adapt to stress, and it doesn't matter if the stress is biological or technological. It's just a stress. They adapt. But technological solutions cannot adapt in return. They're fixed. They're not living. They do not respond to changes in the environment. And modern agriculture has attempted to convert food production to a technological process. But growing food remains a biological process. We're attempting to solve the biological problem of food production by applying technological solutions. The pests that bedevil farmers are biological problems. They can adapt to the technology, but the technology cannot adapt to them. As each technological tool fails, it must be replaced with another newer technological fix, and by the way, that one will fail also. This is the technological treadmill. Farmers are caught on this treadmill, but for them it's called a chemical treadmill, chemical solution treadmill. They're dependent on the cleverness of the tech world to solve their problems because the modern farm has been so damaged by chemicals. that it's lost the ability to respond on its own. The soils are nearly dead or with very low biological diversity. Helpful insects like ladybugs and insect-eating birds are gone because of toxicity in the environment or just loss of habitat in general. 70 years of chemicals have chased farms into the greenhouse, away from the soil, away from nature, and even more towards technology as the savior of food production. Now, we love technology. We love new technology, but we rarely understand it thoroughly. Rapid application of a new technology is exhilarating, and it's typically like a sweepstakes. The first company to use it is going to be the biggest economic winner. Technological breakthroughs are often applied as soon as possible, but very often without a clear understanding of long-term consequences. There's a term for one action that causes many effects, and that's pleiotropy in the genetic world. When one gene is influenced, but a multitude of effects occur as a response to that manipulation, that's pleiotropy. Over time, with technology, we learned that there are often secondary effects, or indirect effects, or just plain unpredictable effects that result from the technologies. We often make initial assumptions about the impact of technologies that turn out to be pretty simplistic, naive, or just plain poorly thought out. The consequences of DDT on the environment, great example. For a temporary reduction in pest abundance, we were also rewarded with pesticide resistance, ecosystem collapse through the loss of beneficial species, magnification of DDT up the food chain, and long-lasting deleterious effects of the environment overall. Biotechnology is the latest technological toy. We're like a child playing with an apparently unloaded gun. We have discovered how to genetically modify an organism with the intent of improving some single aspect of it, but we're applying that technology to a very complex biological system. And we know that it is not possible to modify a single variable in a system without influencing every other variable in that system. We have literally no appreciation of the long-term effects that might follow. What I can tell you this, though, is that biotech is nothing more than a new, more ingenious technological solution to that biological problem of producing food. And the pests are the targets of the biotech cleverness, and they're going to adapt to this technology just as they did to the old technology. So, there you go. That's my soapbox speech. And if the book I wrote, Chasing the Red Queen, that's, I suppose, a really quick summary of what I put in that book. But I don't want to talk about that anymore. I want to veer away from technology and resistance and pesticides and talk about just why we need to focus on the natural qualities of our food. That is, I want to talk about why food is a biological result and why it can't be a technological result, and why that quality takes time. I want to explain why we are like tomatoes. You and I are just like tomatoes. The question is, do we want to be garden tomatoes, or do we want to be greenhouse tomatoes? I think most of you already get that reference, but let me explain it my way. To a gourmet, a garden-ripe tomato is the epitome of fresh food. I don't think there's another food out there that can elicit the same response from the first bite and the second bite and the third bite. The eater's response is almost rhapsodic. You know, no one can take a bite of a garden fresh tomato and not comment on the flavors. Those tomatoes make common foods better. They make common foods special. And almost as rewarding as eating a tomato is watching other people eat one and then just smiling at the expressions on their faces when they do the same thing. So what just happened here? Let's explore what a tomato is and what it represents as sort of an analogy to food in general. A tomato plant is a small ecosystem that's part of a larger ecosystem. it reaches into the soil and it reaches into the air, and it interacts with both the living and the non-living species and components and aspects of the external environment. And the biochemistry of the tomato, the plant, is a function of those interactions. So the internal ecosystem of the plant works with the external ecosystem surrounding it to sort of collaboratively produce this penultimate physical expression, this juicy red seed-filled tomato. The tomato fruit is a result of this plant ecosystem interacting with the ecosystem around it, and the fruit is sort of the intersection of those two ecosystems meeting. And one of those ecosystems is nested within the other one, and I want to emphasize the nestedness aspect. It shouldn't be underestimated because it's a key element that seems to have been lost in this race toward technological improvements in agriculture. The fact that the tomato is an ecosystem that's nested inside another ecosystem that it depends on. The plant begins life as a seed in the soil and responding to different environmental cues, mostly temperature and water. But those two stimulate the dormant embryo to begin rapid cell division and expansion and growth. And as the seedling grows, the roots extend into the soil and they begin to interact with bacteria and fungi and nematodes and large numbers of microbes and invertebrates. Many of those interactions are negative, but many of them are beneficial. Importantly, the positive interactions are necessary for growth. But in many ways, the negative interactions are also necessary for the growth and health of the plant. And that's a very important concept, is that the negative interactions may not be as important as the positive ones, but they are important. Some, like fungal interactions that interact with the roots, like these mycorrhizal fungi. That's a little pine tree, by the way. The little pine tree roots go, you see sort of a circular area at sort of where the roots start extending? That's where the roots are. There are no roots beyond that point on a pine tree. All the rest of that is fungi, ectomycorrhizal fungi that are attached to the roots. And without those fungi attached to the roots, that plant will get about a foot and a half tall, and then it will die. So in sterile soil, pine trees of any species cannot live. They must have mycorrhizal fungi. They provide this plant with all of the things that its roots can't do, and that is nutrients and water primarily. And the fungi get some carbon in return from the plant, but they are an absolutely necessary component of the soil for growth of any conifer, regardless of where it lives. And importantly, as the plant matures and produces flowers that are pollinated by bees and flies and butterflies, the number of pollinations determines the number of seeds that are produced. A large number of organisms roam the surfaces of the plants. Some of those are attempting to eat the leaves and the fruit, the flowers. Others are in search of those organisms to prey on them. The tomato plant not only represents a very large number of interactions with the environment, but it also acts as the context for a great many other interactions. And some of those interactions are an invariable part of the life of the plant. But others are chance encounters. They're serendipitous. They may or may not occur in the life of an individual plant. But all in all, the plant is favored by those interactions, and it endures those interactions. Now, how well the tomato plant, achieves its reproductive potential depends on the quality and the quantity of those interactions between the internal ecosystem and the external ecosystem. Some tomato plants will be more susceptible to the depredations of herbivores. They're attempting to maximize their own reproductive potential. Other plants will be able to resist, and they may be able to defend themselves from predators. Some plants will respond better by growing and interacting with below-ground microbial community. And when they do that, they'll have better access to nutrients. But overall, the negative and beneficial outcomes of these interactions depend largely on the genetic makeup of the plant. So in biology, the genetic makeup of the individual organism is the genotype. And that's the DNA that codes for every trait in each individual. Every gene in an individual is contained in the DNA found in every cell, but not all genes are expressed. So, for example, every cell in my finger contains my entire genome. Every single chromosome with every single gene in every single cell in my finger. Yet my finger, not particularly active. It doesn't use all of that information. It's not needed to be a finger. The task of being a finger cell is really not that complex. Not as much as some other cells in the body. But all of the genes are present, even if they're never used. A lot of those genes are, even in the finger cells, are initially turned off, but may later be turned on. So it's important that they're present. So an example would be the growth of body hair after puberty. Not there. Later on, after some sort of threshold has been crossed, they are there. Some cells are turned on initially and then later turned off. So before we were born, we all expressed fetal hemoglobin, but after we were born, we expressed adult hemoglobin. And then there's a whole bunch of genes in there that are not particularly useful. They're recessive genetics diseases and are best left unused entirely. But they're all there in every single cell. Every cell possesses the entire genetic potential of the individual, but very little of that potential is expressed at any one time. Now, the expression is what we need to get to here. The expression of the genotype, what we actually see in an individual, is called the phenotype. The phenotype can be thought of as the expression of the genotype in a particular environment. In other words, the environment stimulates the genotype to be expressed in different ways and under different conditions. So, for example, in the summer, an Arctic hare is brown, but in the winter, it's white. And that pattern switches back and forth each year. So genes are being turned off, and genes are being turned on, and then they're being turned off, and back and forth over and over. This, by the way, is the emerging study of epigenetics, things that can be turned on and off, not as a result of our growth and maturity, but maybe as a result of our interaction with the environment around us. If the environment doesn't provide the right cues, the genotype doesn't express a particular phenotype. So, for example, the hydrangea, everybody knows hydrangea is a popular plant, makes very large, pretty heads of flowers. They can range in color from pink to deep purple. The particular color depends on the acidity of the soil, and the more acidic soil causes plants to produce flowers. At the blue end of the spectrum, what's important is that the potential for the range of flower colors is always there, but the environment determines what flower color is going to be expressed on a particular plant. The garden tomato is just such an expression of the genotype interacting with the environment. A fully ripened, fresh-picked tomato grown in an outdoor garden is an amazing taste sensation. It's a literal explosion of a multitude of flavors. In contrast, a tomato grown in a greenhouse environment is an insipid pretender. It can have a granular texture, poor color, very little taste, very little complexity. The two fruits are sometimes so unalike as to be unrelated. It's like comparing a Great Dane and a Chihuahua. Are they the same animal? They can share exactly, in the tomato situation, they can share exactly the same genotype. The exact same genotype, but clearly not have the same phenotype. How is this possible? We have to understand the purpose of the tomato fruit and its role in the evolutionary history of the tomato plant. A plant is a long record. It's a record of this evolutionary battle with its environment. For almost as long as there have been flowering plants, there have been any number of insects that have attempted to eat the roots, the stems, the leaves, the flowers, the fruits, the seeds, you name it, on the plant. Plants have very little recourse but to defend themselves against a hungry world. Plants, in fact, are the bottom of the food chain. They cannot run away. They have to defend themselves where they grow. To do this, they can defend themselves with physical protections, in the form of spines and bristles and hairs and any number of other things, structure as well, like in the cactuses. Or they can defend themselves with chemicals that are toxic in one way or another. To some extent, every plant possesses chemical defenses. Every plant. As these defenses have evolved to ward off the insect world, particularly the insect world, but there are a number of other organisms out there that certainly eat plants, but we'll use insects as our example. They've had to develop these compounds, but in the problem with biological systems is the biological systems can also adapt in return. The insects are forced to adapt to overcome the plant's defensive compounds. The plant then, of course, as these insects became less susceptible to their toxins, had to then adapt to produce either better defenses or more defenses in response. And this back and forth process, well, there you go. That's what we call the Red Queen hypothesis. For every adaptation, there's a counter-adaptation. For every counter-adaptation, there's a counter-adaptation, and on and on. And this, the Red Queen hypothesis has been borrowed by a number of different branches of biology, notably pathogens and hosts is a good example, but we've also used it in ecology. The catch here is that there is no adaptation that allows one of the organisms to win the race. There isn't a winning of this race. This is a race that you run, but it's a race that can't be won. There is no finish line. The problem is if you don't run, you lose. There is losing. There's just never winning. Winning means not losing. That's what winning means in this world. And so that's why this is such a great literary analogy for what's going on in biology. The evolutionary arms race, as it's been called, is a battle between organisms in which one is typically trying to eat the other, and the other is, of course, defending itself. And under natural conditions, no one ever holds the upper hand for very long. If they did, the other species would likely go extinct. Every living species of plant, for its entire history, has successfully fended off the challenges from the external environment. And most of the time, this was through chemical defenses. As with all plants, the tomato is biochemically very complex. All plants produce an array of chemical compounds, that are necessary for the day-to-day functions of the plant. These, by the way, these are called primary compounds. Under normal circumstances, these are the compounds that the plant requires for just growth and health. So amino acids, DNA, chlorophyll, proteins, you name it, all of those are those biochemical constructs that help the plant be a plant. Those are primary compounds. Everything else in the plant is what we call a secondary compound or a secondary metabolite. They have been derived from primary compounds in one way or another, like phenols and terpenes and alkaloids. These are all the poisons and toxins, but usually poisons and toxins. Other things. They originated from mutations to the genes for the primary compounds, and those mutations resulted in somewhat modified chemicals that had perhaps new functions. And if the new function assisted the plant in defending itself in any way from herbivores, and that led to increased production of seeds, then that mutation would have been positive and would have been a very important part of the genotype. In plants, we often see dozens to hundreds of these things. And we assume that their presence in the plant is evidence of a long and successful history of defense against animals. That's why they're there. These are adaptations, so they must represent something. These compounds can be found in every part of the plant, from the root tip to the shoot tip, and especially in the fruits and seeds. In the tomato plant, there are over 400 different volatile chemical compounds. 400 just in the tomato plant. All of them are secondary compounds, and at least 30 of those are important contributors to flavor. At least 30. The flavor of the tomato is a delicate balance of these compounds in combination with some pretty basic ones, such as sugar, sweetness, and sour, and bitter, and those. Why are these so-called defense compounds involved in flavor, particularly in what we would consider good flavor? Well, herbivores attack The tomato at every stage in life. Let's see. Yeah. Itself from attacks on, oh, I can hear myself now. Every part of the plant at every growth stage. To complete its life cycle, the plant has to protect each of these different parts. The leaves are needed to produce sugars to grow the plant, so they're vital. They have to be protected. The roots are needed to absorb water and nutrients from the soil, so they're vital, and they have to be protected. Eventually, the plant has to produce flowers and seeds and fruits to ensure the genetic continuity of the plant and the family line into the next generation, and those structures have to be defended vigorously. The defense of leaves and roots and stems helps the plant produce enough energy to complete this cycle, and so the defense of every part of the plant is critical. However, the plant is also faced with attracting friends while repelling enemies, and thus different parts of the plant are defended to different degrees. Flowers are chemically defended differently than our seeds. Flowers, are the window dressing. They're the advertisement to attract pollinators. So in most cases, the plant really doesn't want to attract lots of insects, but in the case of pollination, it's important to put signs out that say, this store is now open, and there's free food inside. But they're only necessary to attract the pollinators, and once the pollination has been achieved, the colorful flower parts typically fade or fall away. And then they cease to be a visual attraction, and they have a very different value than seeds. The seeds are the offspring of the plant, and so they have to be defended in very different ways. After pollination, and when seeds are developing, they're not colorful, they're not obvious. They're hidden and obscured from view. At that point, the young fruit is the young fruit just after pollination and the flower has started to fade. It's a fascinating biochemical combination of both defense and non-defense compounds, depending on the stage it's in. Eventually, the plant uses fruit to attract fruit eaters, but this is only true when the fruit is brightly colored, and not when it's green. Until the fruit is ripe, it's physically or chemically defended because the seeds contained inside are still developing and they're highly vulnerable. During this stage, the fruit is not obvious. It blends in. But after the seeds mature, the fruit ripens, and the change to a bright color that contrasts with the green is an indicator to fruit eaters that the fruit is now available. It's ready for eating, and it's undefended. And it's a literal advertisement for food. At that point, animals can consume this sweet, tasty, nutritious, and non-toxic fruit that contains the mature seeds, and the fruit typically passes very quickly through the animals and before the seeds can be digested. And it's no accident that fruit has a great deal of fiber in it. It enhances the rapid passage through digestive systems. So the stages of development in the tomato plant require a wide range of different chemical compounds for ensuring this completion of this reproductive process. And that leads to the ultimate goal of dispersing tomato seeds. The abundance of these compounds goes up and down inside the plant, but the numbers of different compounds is really surprisingly very high. Here's the point of my story. The taste of that tomato, what we find so attractive is a combination of the chemicals that are among the very last to develop in the fruit. They aren't there when the fruit is picked green or pink or slightly red. They're there when it is fully red. It's not until it's fully ripened that the full complement of the flavors are present. The vitamins, the proteins, amino acids, the sugars, these are all substances that are nutritious, but they're only present in certain amounts. The volatile compounds contribute to flavor, and they also add other complements to the basic nutrition. They're often residual defensive compounds. from earlier stages that have been broken down, partly broken down, or being reused in other ways. All of these chemicals come together to give the tomato its characteristic flavor and its characteristic qualities. And all of them are the result of the interaction between the tomato plant and the environment, both in the past and in the present. Today we grow the vast majority of tomatoes that we eat in greenhouses and other controlled environments. Literally all of the tomatoes sold in conventional grocery stores, including most organic tomatoes, are rarely grown outside in nature. They are grown in very small amounts of relatively sterile soil and often with no soil at all, and with a steady supply of artificial fertilizers. In other words, they're grown by recipe. Every tomato plant is now pushed to produce enormous quantities of fruit under non-natural conditions and with no interaction with the environment. And yes, I understand there's a need to produce large quantities of food. Yeah, for 327 million hungry Americans. But when we taste a greenhouse tomato, we should not wonder at its lack of tomato flavor. Instead, we should ask a much more important and relevant question. If the phenotype of the plant is the interaction between the genotype and the environment, then how is it possible to achieve the phenotype if the genotype never has an opportunity to interact with the environment? In simpler terms, how can a tomato grow up properly if it never goes outside? To get a tasty tomato, the tomato plant has to go outside. It has to interact with the environment to which it is adapted so that its genotype can be fully expressed. The tomato plant, like many plants, doesn't have to produce defensive compounds. Those defensive compounds that become part of the flavor of the plant, it does not have to produce them. Many plants don't use the energy necessary for defense unless they have been attacked. So the plants defend themselves only after detecting physical damage from an herbivore. When we grow tomato plants that never experience the stress of being eaten or attacked, they may not be induced to produce the compounds that create the best tasting fruit or those that have the most health benefits. So by analogy, a human individual can have the genetic potential for being a very fast runner, but unless she forces her bones and muscles to become stronger by the stress of exercise, she'll never achieve that physical potential. Greenhouse tomatoes will never be as good as garden tomatoes because their true character can only be expressed under slightly stressful conditions, somewhat similar to those that cause the plant to evolve and maintain the genotype that it has in the first place. The tomatoes we buy today have lived their entire lives in a stress-free environment. The natural environment is a multi-species, multi-stress period of time in which the plants adjust to and accommodate the stress while fulfilling their evolutionary goal of reproducing into the next generation, of being successful at that. When you eat a wonderfully tasty garden tomato, you're experiencing the full expression of the plant's genetic potential with all its vitamins and protein and antioxidant benefits. When you eat a greenhouse tomato, you're being cheated. The benefits are not the same. They can't be the same. The same principle applies to all organisms. Unless the genetic, biochemical, multi-species internal ecosystem of any organism is exposed to the multi-factor, multi-species external ecosystem in which it normally resides, the tomato of that organism can't be produced. So yes, the full expression of the individual is a function of many species, because each of us contains a world of minute organisms inside our bodies. We contain an internal ecosystem that can and must interact with the outside world if we're going to remain healthy. All individual plants are ecosystems. All the animals that eat those plants are ecosystems, and they interact with those plants. And all the communities of plants and animals are ecosystems that interact with other ecosystems, are nested within those ecosystems. The ecosystem of the individual is adapted to the larger ecosystem. And in ways that we can't count. And the full potential of the individual is expressed when its healthy internal ecosystem is interacting with the surrounding external ecosystem, which, by the way, must also be healthy. Organisms that are adapted to certain environments best express their abilities in that environment. Their internal ecosystems are healthiest when they're embedded in the external ecosystem to which they are adapted. When they grow in a different environment, whether it's more stressful or less stressful, the genetic potential of the organism cannot be realized. In addition, if the natural environment is lacking important factors or it's been simplified and lacks natural complexity, this is going to change the relationship between the internal and external worlds. The concept applies to humans completely. Our ability to thrive can be either enhanced or compromised by the quality of the external environment because it interacts with and it determines the quality of our internal environment. At no point in our lives are we separate from our environment. And in fact, nothing could be more dangerous to our well-being. Even before birth, whatever our mothers ate or drank or consumed affected our nutrition and our biochemical balance. Were this not true, pregnant mothers would not be discouraged from limiting their intake of caffeine or alcohol or a large number of medications, nor would prenatal health checkups be necessary, but they are. Infant mortality rates dramatically decline when pregnant women are more aware of how the outside world affects their inside world. So humans are a product of our ecosystems, plural. We not only can't exist without our surrounding ecosystem, we wouldn't be here without it. The interaction between our internal ecosystem and the external ecosystem is more than just the exchange of food before and after it's eaten. The bacteria in our gut are colonized and recolonized from the outside, but the human body has far more interaction with the world than that. We have at least 5 senses, and we take information from the outside and interpret it on the inside. We breathe in the air, we drink in the water, we react to allergens. We provide a haven for bacteria and pathogens and parasites and any number of other things. We're home to more bacterial cells than human cells. And when the environment surrounding us doesn't help us maintain a healthy internal ecosystem, our personal health suffers. We are simplifying and damaging our external ecosystem in so many different ways. The long-term effects of this simplified external ecosystem on our internal ecosystem health is just beginning to be recognized, and the implications are not good ones. I've used a plant, this tomato, those tomatoes, yeah, as an example of the importance of the external environment to the physical and biochemical expression of the potential of the internal environment. What I mean, though, is that the quality of the food we eat is more than just the calories. It's the kind of calories. It's the context of the calories. It's the quality of those calories. For us to express our potential as humans, for us to be of the highest quality possible, our food must also be of high quality. We are and we have been on this path of lowering quality and emphasizing quantity by reducing the biological process of food production and turning it into a technological process. And if what we eat is produced as if it is no more than a recipe for making calories, then we are essentially saying that our evolutionary history and that of our food has no bearing on our health. We're saying that the 30 trillion bacteria in our gut that are apparently integral to our health and development can survive on bleached, vitamin-enriched, gluten-enhanced, genetically manipulated wheat. We're saying that even though we have next to no understanding of how our microbiome contributes to our health and how that contribution is influenced by the food we eat, we can continue to simplify both our food and the ecosystem around us without any consequences. If that's what we're saying, then we're missing a fact that stares us directly in the face. We are not only what we eat, we also are not what we do not eat. If we don't eat quality, then how can we expect to be quality? In closing my rant, I would like to say that we simplify and modify our world and our food at our peril. All tomatoes are not created equal. To understand a tomato, we have to understand the evolutionary history of that tomato. We have to understand what it means to be a tomato and what it means to be a tomato of quality, and I encourage everyone here to try to be a tomato of quality. This is the direction I'm going, and the book I'm working on now is more taking a look at the importance of how we are nested. We are a nested ecosystem inside a much larger ecosystem, and each of us is a little ecosystem walking around on two legs, but each of us demands and requires that the surrounding ecosystem be of high quality, otherwise we cannot be of high quality either. And we're seeing the consequences of this in the health of our culture, not just our individual health, but the health of our culture and the health of our species. The ramifications of simplifying our food supply that we've seen over the past couple of decades, and in innumerable ways when it comes to individual health, we have to start thinking about what this means for our health as a population and what it means for our health as a species, because we're doing this to the entire world. And we're exporting our technology to other countries and encouraging them to use that technology as well. We have to understand that this is a pathway that is not sustainable. And I don't mean that in the way that we use sustainability in farming. I mean that it's not sustainable in the long run for the health of us as a species. So we've heard a lot about that earlier today and also last night when it comes to chemicals, genetically modified crops, the industrial processes we use to produce food. All of those things are linked. We need to take a step back and ask ourselves, not necessarily, we should ask what it means for us as individuals, but not necessarily what it means for us as individuals, but what this pattern, this program of food production means in the longer term scope of things. And what I'm going to suggest is that we must pay attention to the broader scope, what it means to all of us, and then ask ourselves the very hard question as a society whether or not this is highly immoral, what we are doing to food and what that action does to us. So I want to thank you for your patience and your very generous attention, and I would be happy if we have time to take any questions that you might have. Yes, ma'am.
First, when you said organic, I have tomatoes. I have a bunch of friends that are willing to spend a lot more money for heirloom tomatoes. And I'm like, is that just a title? Or is it just, is it worth the extra money because it's an heirloom and still has the green leaves attached to it? But that's the second section of that is, you're talking about the greenhouse. My husband, who's a wonderful gardener, but he wants a greenhouse for Hanukkah so he can grow more stuff, and he also wants to sprout a whole bunch of stuff in the basement. So the way I'm hearing a lot of what you're saying is it might not be worth it for him to get the greenhouse for Hanukkah and sprout stuff in the basement. Oh, that's what I'm trying to learn about.
Anytime someone's growing their own food, I'm 100% in favor of that, 100%. And I don't want to imply that a greenhouse-grown tomato does not have any quality, but let's be clear that it cannot have the same quality, right? There are going to be some components missing. Are they important components? I don't know. It's really hard to say. Taste is an important component to me, and they quite often don't have that. Your question about heirloom tomatoes and organic tomatoes in the grocery store chains are very aware of how much people will pay for organic and heirloom, and they are more than willing to find people to grow those products. You'll notice that the heirloom tomato, you can usually tell them because they have green tops and they're wrinkled and they quite often are scarred. But they're so perfect these days, you have to wonder, how in the world did you manage to grow an heirloom tomato with no scars on it? There weren't any organisms around attempting to eat them, is the main reason. They probably do have better flavor. They probably do. But anytime money can be made, you know that there's going to be an attempt for someone to try to provide that to buyers. If that's what buyers want, they will find it for them. Organic tomatoes cannot be grown in hydroponic systems because they can't get certified in hydroponic systems, but they can be grown in hothouses and greenhouses. So many of the organic tomatoes, again, this is what others have said before me up here, is that, and Stephen alluded to this also, find out who your growers are, find out who your suppliers are, find out who you trust, and work with them. If we want to stimulate an economy that produces higher quality food, then we have to go find those people and work with them. Otherwise, I think that we're leaving our food supply to more commercial interests, and we know pretty well, I think, what direction that will go. Don't give up on the greenhouse, absolutely. Grow your own food. If there are no more questions, all right, thank you for your time.